My husband knocked out my brother for calling me a whore, and my parents want me to choose. This past weekend, my husband and I went to my parents' house for a barbecue. It was one of those beautiful days you look forward to. Good food, laughter, and time spent with loved ones. Everything seemed to be going smoothly, and for the most part, it was. That was until my brother decided, for reasons I still cannot comprehend, to start picking on me. At first, it was subtle. He made a few snide remarks about my choices and poked fun at me in front of others. I tried to brush it off as harmless teasing, but it became clear that his words were targeted, and his tone was far from playful. The jabs turned sharper, more personal, and outright demeaning. He called me names, belittled me, and made me feel small in a space where I should have felt loved and secure. I was taken aback. This behavior was so unlike him. My brother has never spoken to me or anyone else in this way before, at least not to my knowledge. My initial reaction was confusion. Why was he doing this? What had I done to provoke such hostility? I stood there frozen, while my mind raced to make sense of his outburst. It was my husband who stepped in. Seeing how upset I was, he calmly pulled my brother aside to talk. My husband is not a confrontational person by nature, but he's fiercely protective. Whatever he said to my brother must have worked because the insults stopped, for a while. About an hour later, the atmosphere at the barbecue had relaxed again. My husband and I were standing around, chatting with some friends and family members, when my brother approached me. At first, I thought he was going to apologize, or at least make an effort to smooth things over. Instead, he leaned in close enough for everyone nearby to hear and said something I will never forget. "You know you're a fucking whore, right?" His words were venomous, spoken loudly enough that almost everyone at the party stopped what they were doing and turned to look. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the humiliation washed over me. For a moment, I couldn't move or speak. I was too shocked, too hurt to react. Then I felt a slight nudge, a push to the side. My husband had stepped in front of me, his face a mask of controlled anger. Before I could process what was happening, my brother was on the ground, unconscious, with blood trickling from his nose. My mother's frantic yelling cut through the stunned silence as she rushed to my brother's side. Meanwhile, my husband stood firm, his voice steady but laced with fury. "You don't talk to my wife like that," he said. "I warned you." It all happened so fast that I struggled to piece it together. To be clear, my husband did not hurt me in any way when he stepped in. The push he gave me was gentle, more of a nudge to move me out of harm's way than anything else. I stumbled back a single step, and that was it. He was focused entirely on defending me, and for that I couldn't be angry at him. But anger was all I felt toward my brother. The entire day, he had been demeaning, insulting, and belittling. His behavior was baffling. This wasn't the brother I knew, the one who had always been protective and supportive in the past. What had changed? Why was he suddenly so cruel? His words echoed in my mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. The worst part was that I couldn't understand where it was coming from. Then came the fallout. My parents, horrified by the violence, confronted me and my husband later that day. They issued an ultimatum. Either I leave my husband and divorce him, or they would cut me out of their lives completely. Their anger was palpable, and their disappointment stung. They went as far as to threaten my husband with an assault charge, but he remained unbothered. If anything, he seemed annoyed that he had only landed a single punch, as he put it. My husband doesn't care what my parents think of him. He only cares about protecting me, and for that I love him even more. However, I was now trapped in an impossible situation. My parents have always been there for me, supporting me through thick and thin. They are the people I turn to during life's most challenging moments. But my husband is my partner, my rock, and the person I chose to spend my life with. The thought of losing either of them was unbearable. My parents' ultimatum felt like a knife to the heart, cutting through years of trust and love. I knew they were serious because they had never issued such a demand before. On one hand, I understood their perspective. They were horrified by what had happened, and their instinct was to protect my brother, no matter how wrong he was. On the other hand, their lack of concern for how I had been treated by my brother felt like a betrayal. It was as though my pain didn't matter, as though I was expendable. I found myself spiraling, unsure of what to do. My husband remained steadfast in his support, assuring me that we would get through this together. He told me not to worry about my parents' threats or the possibility of legal action. He would handle whatever came our way, but his unwavering confidence didn't ease my anxiety. Messages began pouring in from friends and other family members, most of whom condemned my husband's actions, but offered me their support. A few leaned toward agreeing with my husband, understanding his need to stand up for me, but the majority seemed torn. The tension in the air was palpable the moment my husband and I stepped into my parents' home. They had called me over to talk, but their request had come with a condition. I was to come alone. They didn't want my husband in their house, claiming his presence would only escalate things. My husband, however, was having none of it. He flat out refused to let me go by myself, pointing out how unfair and manipulative the situation was. "If you go alone," he said, his tone firm yet calm, "they'll gang up on you. I won't let that happen. If I'm not welcome, then you don't need to be there either. I hesitated, torn between the desire to address the situation with my parents and my loyalty to my husband. Ultimately, I knew he was right. My parents weren't inviting me over to mend fences. They were likely trying to reinforce their ultimatum and make me choose. So, we went together, and I braced myself for what I knew would be an emotionally charged confrontation. When we arrived, my parents' displeasure was evident. My mother, always one to speak her mind, was ready to lash out the moment she saw my husband. Her lips tightened into a thin line, and she opened her mouth to say something. But my husband cut her off before she could get a word in. "I'm not here for you," he said bluntly, his voice steady and unwavering. "I'm here for my wife. If you try to force me to leave, she'll leave with me." I nodded, standing by his side. His declaration left my mother momentarily speechless. She exchanged a glance with my father, who looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Finally, with visible reluctance, they agreed to let us both stay. My brother was there too, sitting in the corner of the room with his head bowed. His face bore the evidence of the weekend's events: a swollen nose and chipped teeth. He refused to look at me or my husband, keeping his gaze firmly fixed on the floor, even when he spoke. The conversation began with awkward small talk, but it quickly turned to the real reason for the meeting: my brother's behavior. At first, he tried to remain quiet, but my parents pushed him to explain himself. Eventually, he muttered the truth in a barely audible voice. "I broke up with my girlfriend," he said, his tone bitter. "Or, well, she broke up with me." This revelation was news to me. My brother and I were not particularly close, so I hadn't known about the breakup. To be honest, I didn't care much about the details. What I cared about was why he had decided to take out his frustrations on me. He hesitated before continuing, clearly uncomfortable. "I kept seeing your posts," he admitted, still avoiding eye contact. "Your perfect life with your perfect husband. It was all over my feed. Every time I opened social media, there it was. You have everything I don't." It took me a moment to process what he was saying. My social media activity isn't anything extraordinary. I mainly use it to share moments with my husband. Vacations, date nights, silly selfies. I had no idea these posts, which I thought were harmless, had been fueling my brother's jealousy. "It got worse," he added, his voice growing quieter, "when I overheard you talking to Mom about having kids. You're trying to have a baby, and everything in my life is falling apart, and yours is perfect." It made me so angry. His words were like a punch to the gut. I didn't know whether to feel angry or pity him. On one hand, I could understand that he was hurting. Losing a relationship is never easy, and social media often paints a misleadingly perfect picture of other people's lives. On the other hand, his feelings didn't justify the way he had treated me. His insults, his cruel words, they were inexcusable. "So because your life is falling apart, you decided to take it out on me?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "Do you have any idea how much your words hurt me? Why would you call me a whore? Do you really think that about me?" He flinched, but didn't respond. I pressed on, desperate for an explanation. "You know my husband was my first and only. You know we've been together for years. What part of trying to have a child with the man I love makes me a whore?" Again, he stayed silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. Frustrated, I turned to my parents. "Why didn't you step in?" I demanded. "Why didn't you tell him to leave when he started insulting me? Why didn't you defend me?" My father looked uncomfortable, glancing at my mother for support. She sighed heavily before answering. "I told your father to let it be," she admitted. "I didn't think he was actually hurting anyone. I thought he was just venting." "Not hurting anyone?" I repeated, my voice rising. "He was tearing me down all day and you just stood by and let it happen? Do I not matter to you?" My father tried to interject, but my mother cut him off. "We were trying to protect your brother," she said, her tone defensive. "He's going through a rough time, and we didn't want to make things worse for him." "And what about me?" I shot back. "Did it not occur to you that I needed protecting too?" The room fell silent. My father looked away, clearly ashamed, while my mother struggled to come up with a response. Finally, my father spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ultimatum was your mother's idea," he admitted. "I went along with it, but I don't agree with it." His words stung, but they also provided a glimmer of hope. At least one of my parents seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. As the conversation wound down, my husband apologized to my parents for the incident, though he refused to apologize to my brother. When my mother demanded he do so, he stood his ground. "No," he said firmly. "I won't apologize for defending my wife. Your son was warned, and he chose to ignore that warning. He got what he deserved." My mother bristled at his words, but my husband didn't back down. Turning to my father, he asked, "What would you do if someone called your wife a whore?" My father hesitated before answering. "I would talk to them," he said. "I would never resort to violence." My husband laughed bitterly. "Then you're a spineless man," he said, "because no one should ever be allowed to demean your wife like that." The room exploded into chaos. My mother's face turned red with anger, and I could see her preparing to lash out. That was when I decided it was time to leave. I stood, addressing my parents with as much composure as I could muster. The ultimatum you gave me broke the trust I had in you, I said. I understand you wanted to protect my brother, but in doing so, you hurt me. I'm going low contact for now. Whether or not we rebuild our relationship is up to you. My husband and I left shortly after, but not before he politely told my father, it's time to grow a backbone. The look on my mother's face was one of shame, though whether it was directed at my father or herself, I couldn't tell. On the drive home, my husband apologized for escalating the situation, but assured me that he would handle any fallout. I wasn't sure where things would go from here, but one thing was certain. My husband had my back, and I had his. For now, that was enough. I confronted my brother one last time before we left my parents' house. I needed answers. I had to know why he had gone after me with such venom. What had I done to deserve this? When I asked him directly why he had said those awful things, he avoided my gaze, staring down at the floor as though it held all the answers. He refused to explain himself, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't make out. Why the whore comment? I asked, my voice trembling. You know my husband was my first and only. You know that I've been loyal to him and only him all these years. How could you say something so vile knowing it wasn't true? He didn't respond, his silence only fueling my frustration. I pressed further. Does the fact that I'm trying to have a baby with my husband make me a whore? Is that what you think? Because it involves sex? At that, he finally looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment or anger. I couldn't tell which. He still refused to answer, shaking his head before storming out of the room. Watching him leave, I felt a mixture of anger and sadness. There was no apology, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. When he was gone, I turned to my parents, desperate for some sort of validation, some acknowledgement that what had happened wasn't okay. Why didn't you step in? I demanded, my voice cracking. Why didn't you tell him to stop? Why didn't you tell him to leave when he started attacking me? My father looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat like a child caught doing something wrong. I wanted to, he admitted hesitantly, but your mother told me to let him be. She said he wasn't actually hurting anyone. Not hurting anyone? I repeated incredulously. He spent the entire day tearing me down, calling me names, humiliating me in front of everyone. How is that not hurting anyone? Do I not matter to you? My mother's expression was unreadable, but she didn't respond right away. After a long pause, she finally said, we were trying to protect your brother. He's been going through a hard time, and we didn't want to make it worse for him. I stared at her in disbelief. And what about me? I asked, my voice rising. Do I not deserve protection? Do I not deserve to be defended when I'm being attacked? There was another long silence. My mother wouldn't meet my gaze, and my father looked at her, as if waiting for her to speak. When she didn't, he finally said, the ultimatum, that was her idea. I didn't agree with it, but I went along with it. His words stung, though they didn't surprise me. My father had always been the more passive of the two, often deferring to my mother's judgment. But hearing him admit that he had gone along with something he knew was wrong made me feel even more isolated. The people who were supposed to be my support system had chosen to protect my brother at my expense. The conversation eventually circled back to my husband, who had been quiet up to this point, letting me take the lead. My parents demanded an apology from him, not to them, but to my brother. My mother, in particular, was insistent, her voice growing sharper with each demand. You need to apologize to your brother, she said firmly. No matter what he said, hitting him was not the answer. My husband didn't hesitate. No, he said flatly. I'm not apologizing. I warned him and he chose not to listen. He got what he deserved. His refusal only seemed to anger my mother further. It doesn't matter, she snapped. You can't go around hitting people just because they say something you don't like. My husband turned to my father, his expression calm but steely. What would you do if someone called your wife a whore? He asked pointedly. My father hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I would talk to them, he said after a long pause. I would never hit someone. My husband let out a bitter laugh. Then you're a spineless man, he said bluntly. Because no one should ever be allowed to demean your wife like that. If you're not willing to stand up for her, what's the point of being her husband? My mother's face turned red with anger, her hands clenched into fists. How dare you speak to him like that? She shouted. But my husband didn't flinch. He remained calm, his gaze unwavering. It was at that moment that I realized the conversation was going nowhere. My parents weren't going to see reason, and my husband wasn't going to back down. And I didn't want him to. He had defended me when no one else would, and I wasn't about to let him be vilified for that. I stood up, placing a hand on my husband's arm. It's time to go, I said quietly. As we prepared to leave, I turned to my parents one last time. The ultimatum you gave me broke my trust in you, I said, my voice trembling. I understand you wanted to protect my brother, but in doing so, you hurt me. Right now, I don't want anything to do with him, and I need time to figure out where I stand with you. My mother's expression softened slightly, but she didn't respond. My father looked as though he wanted to say something but held back. On the way out, my husband paused to speak to my father. It's time to grow a backbone, he said, his tone not unkind but firm. My father looked down, avoiding his gaze, and I thought I saw a flicker of shame cross my mother's face. In the car ride home, my husband finally broke the silence. I'm sorry if I escalated things, he said, his voice softer now, but it needed to be said. Your father needed to hear it. I reached over and squeezed his hand. You don't need to apologize, I said. You stood up for me when no one else would. That means everything to me. He smiled faintly, but his expression was serious. Whatever comes next, we'll deal with it together. I'll take any punishment that comes my way, but I won't let you go through this alone. His words filled me with a sense of relief, even as I grappled with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. For now, I knew one thing. I wasn't alone in this. And that was enough. The days after that meeting with my parents felt like a haze. My husband and I tried to return to our normal lives, but the quiet left behind by the conflict lingered, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't stop questioning everything. How had I ended up being the one cast aside by the very people who were supposed to stand by me no matter what? The betrayal replayed in my mind over and over, gnawing at me whenever I had a moment to myself. A few days later, my mother called. Her voice was softer than usual, almost apologetic, but not quite there yet. Are you really going to cut us out completely? She asked. No, Mom, I said, holding back the wave of emotions threatening to overtake me. I don't want to cut you off, but I need space. What you and Dad did hurt me deeply, and I can't pretend it didn't. As for my brother, I don't want anything to do with him until he's ready to take responsibility and apologize. There was a long silence on the other end, punctuated by a heavy sigh. We understand, she said finally. Her tone carried an undertone of reluctance, but it was a first step.